It was a calm afternoon on May 7th, 2017, in the small town of Bealier, Ohio, when everything suddenly changed. David Kenny, along with his wife Sherry and their young daughter, went to visit his close friend Brad McGary. They had a simple task in mind, returning a weed trimmer, but as they approached the house, something didn't feel right. No one answered the front door, and a growing sense of worry took hold of the family. David LED'd them around to the back. Where they found the service door slightly open inside the house was a mess, with clear signs that something had gone terribly wrong. Sherry called out for Brad, but the only response was an eerie silence. When Brad didn't answer, David decided to check the basement. What he found there would change their lives forever. David Kenny was a young man who led an ordinary life. As he reached the age of 21, his mother decided to throw a big celebration in his honor. Among the guests at this party was Sherry, a beautiful single mother who attended with her son. During the course of the evening, David found himself deeply captivated by Sherry, feeling an instant connection. The next day, he confided in his mother that he had found the love of his life and was determined to make his relationship with Sherry official. Despite Sherry's admirable qualities, some people in David's circle questioned his decision to marry a woman with 3 young children, citing the heavy responsibility it entailed for someone so young. However, David was a young man full of commitment and love. He was ready to take on the responsibilities that came with integrating into Sherry's family and building a beautiful life together to ensure he could provide for his new family. David enrolled in a course to become a coal miner, a tough and risky job, but one that offered good pay to cover the needs of his household. It was during this training that David met Brad McGary. Brad, born in the 1970s in Cambridge, Ohio, had faced numerous challenges growing up. Openly gay, in a conservative environment, Brad had endured insults and prejudice, but had always stood firm in living his truth over time. He built a close-knit group of friends and pursued a career in hairstyling. Though in a small working-class town, it was a challenging profession. Eventually, Brad made the bold decision to switch careers, opting to become a coal miner, despite the stark contrast to his previous work. David and Brad quickly became friends with Brad, even becoming a beloved figure in David's family, earning the affectionate nickname Uncle Brad from David's children. The two friends were inseparable, always sharing jokes and good times together. By 2017, David was 30 years old, happily married to Sherry, and their children were growing up. Brad, on the other hand, was balancing his work-family time and a secret romance. On May 7th, 2017, after attending a family gathering, Brad told a cousin that he needed to return to his home for a meeting later that day around 6:15 p.m. David, Sherry, and their youngest daughter stopped by Brad's house. They were surprised when Brad didn't answer the door. Even though his car was parked outside, concerned, they went around to the back of the house and found the service door unlocked. After calling out to Brad, without a response, David entered the house. While Sher searched upstairs, David's search led him to the basement, where he was met with a horrifying sight: Brad's lifeless body lying in a pool of blood. Sherry, responding to her husband's scream, rushed downstairs and was equally shocked by the grim scene. Sherry immediately called 911, and the police were soon alerted to the discovery of Brad's body, the victim of a fatal gunshot wound. When the police arrived, they found David and Sherry visibly shaken, recounting their story of how they had come to check on their friend and were met with a terrible tragedy. The couple explained their close relationship with Brad, emphasizing the deep bond that had formed over the years. The Kenny family shared that they often spent holidays with Brad, and their children loved him like an uncle. They had even planned a trip to the Bahamas with him in August of that year. When asked about any enemies or troubling circumstances in Brad's life, David and Sherry mentioned that Brad had recently ended a tumultuous relationship with a man named Scotty. Although they didn't know his last name, they described the relationship as fraught with conflict, with frequent, heated arguments. After gathering as much information as possible from the witnesses, the officers began to thoroughly examine the scene before drawing any conclusions in the basement. They found Brad's body lying face down on the floor, with a large pool of blood surrounding his head at first glance. It was clear that he had been shot, at least once in the head. Despite the obvious signs, the officers initially speculated that Brad might have been going through a difficult time and possibly taken his own life. When the forensic expert arrived at the scene, he asked the officers if they had found a weapon, to which they replied that they had not. However, since it's common for individuals who take their own lives to fall on the weapon, the forensic team decided to turn the body over upon doing so. They found no weapon, quickly dispelling the initial suicide theory. As they continued to survey the house, the police tried to piece together the crime scene. They noticed that the house seemed to have been ransacked in a peculiar way. The kitchen was in disarray, with several drawers left open, and the living room was also in a state of chaos. The authorities initially suspected that Brad's death might have been the result of a robbery gone wrong, however. After conducting a more thorough inspection, the detectives realized that no valuable items had been stolen. Despite there being several worth take-back, they also noted that Brad was a collector of rural-style art, and his home contained many valuable items if the intruder had been a common thief. It was also odd that the television remained in place and there was money scattered on the floor. Considering all these clues, the police became convinced that the robbery was staged to mislead them. Given that Brad was an openly gay man working in a coal mine, the detectives considered the possibility that he might have upset some of his more conservative co-workers, potentially leading to a hate crime. However, when they spoke with his colleagues at the mine, they were surprised to find that everyone respected and admired Brad, describing him as a good man. This theory was quickly discarded. The detectives also interviewed Brad's friends and family, trying to establish a timeline and gather as much information as possible. According to David and Sherry's statement at the scene, Brad had recently ended a toxic relationship with a man named Scotty, which was confirmed by Brad's friend Wendy told the police that she had also been against the relationship, noting that Brad had become too involved with Scotty and things had started to get very strange following this lead. The detectives obtained the full name of Scotty and immediately went to his house to question him. However, when they arrived, Scotty's mother informed them that he had been in jail for 3 months for violating his probation. While this ruled out Scotty as the perpetrator, the detectives did not completely dismiss him as a suspect. They theorized that he might have orchestrated the crime from behind bars with the help of an accomplice. The police visited Scotty in jail to inform him of his ex-boyfriend's death and gauge his reaction. Scotty seemed genuinely shaken by the news, and by the end of the interview, the detectives had nearly ruled out his involvement in the crime. Desperate for answers, the detective decided to canvass the neighborhood to see if any cameras had captured footage near Brad's house. Fortunately, a neighbor had a camera facing the street close to Brad's home, which could potentially reveal who had come and gone. While they began reviewing the hours of footage, they continued interviewing friends and family. The case seemed to be reaching a dead end until 2 days later, when the detectives interviewed a cousin of Brad, whose testimony shifted the investigation. He revealed that on the day of the incident, Brad had left the family lunch gathering between 1:30 and 2 p.m., but not before mentioning that a man named DJ was supposed to visit his house. He added that Brad had jokingly said he was planning to take a nap with his guest, hinting at a romantic intention. He further disclosed that Brad had confided in her that the man he was seeing was married and had not yet come out to his wife about their homosexual relationship. He also told the detectives that the relationship with DJ had been ono for years and that they had managed to keep it under wraps. Despite being reluctant to reveal the true identity of Brad's lover, he finally gave in under the pressure of the lead investigator dropping a bombshell name. The officer was stunned to hear that DJ was actually David, the very man who had discovered Brad's lifeless body. When asked if she was certain about her statements, he confirmed that David was indeed the only man Brad had ever mentioned to her. The detectives later commented that when they discovered DJ was David, the person who had found the body while visiting the house with his family, everything suddenly became clear up. Until that point, David had been viewed as a significant witness in the case. appearing genuinely shaken and grieving over his friend's death. This unexpected twist in the story, however, instantly turned him into the prime suspect. The detectives, under the guise of needing to retrieve photos from his phone related to the crime scene, convinced David to hand over his device. In reality, they were tracking his location during the time Brad was killed and searching for evidence that might confirm a relationship beyond mere friendship. When they viewed the phone's location data, they discovered that David's phone had been at Brad's house at the time of the fatal shooting. Although David had deleted incriminating messages, a deeper forensic analysis uncovered text messages between him and Brad that confirmed their sexual relationship. Meanwhile, the team reviewing the footage from Brad's neighbor's surveillance camera found that David had indeed driven to Brad's house just before the estimated time of the attack. Notably, he had arrived in his wife's car, not his own. They documented the duration of his visit, noting that he left about 40 minutes later. The footage also captured David returning hours later in his truck, accompanied by his family, under the pretense of delivering a weed trimmer that Brad had supposedly requested. After compiling all this evidence, the police were confident they had enough to prove that David had been at Brad's house both before and during the time of his death. It was time to confront him with the truth. When the detectives presented David with the damning data retrieved from his phone, he admitted to being at the house but changed his story multiple times during the lengthy interrogation, offering up to 7 or 8 different versions of events. At one point, David claimed that a third, unidentified man had been in Brad's house, and after a heated argument, this unknown individual shot Brad. He insisted that the man had threatened him into silence before allowing him to leave. However, the detective made it clear that he didn't believe this story, prompting David to alter his account once again when pressed to tell the truth. David eventually confessed to hiding his affair from his wife, Sherry, but insisted that it had only been going on for a few months, not years. He claimed that Brad had not been pressuring him to leave his wife and move in together, but had grown angry when David tried to end their romantic relationship that afternoon. David alleged that Brad had brandished a gun, waving it in his face, which terrified him. He said the argument escalated into a physical struggle, during which he managed to wrestle the gun away and shot Brad in the forehead. Asserting that he had acted in self-defense, David also admitted to firing another shot at Brad while he was on the ground. The detectives quickly refuted this version of events, pointing out that the basic laws of physics made David's account impossible. The forensic analysis of Brad's body revealed that he had been shot twice, both times in the back of the head, indicating that the shooter had been standing behind him. When asked about the weapon, David claimed he had disposed of it while fleeing the scene. Law enforcement officers were seen combing the area in the days that followed, but the murder weapon was never recovered. Despite the missing weapon, the investigators were certain they had their man. Before taking David to jail, they allowed him to speak with his wife. The conversation between David and Sherry was closely observed by the detectives. David confessed to Sherry about the affair and expressed regret for not handling things differently, admitting that he couldn't undo what had been done. Sherry, shocked by the enormity of his revelation, was left speechless. David reiterated to her what he had told the detectives. Sherry, through tears, asked him if he was mocking her with such an explanation, and said she couldn't even bear to look at him. This conversation confirmed to the police that Sherry had had no prior knowledge of the events that had transpired behind her back on May 9th. David was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. Investigators hypothesized that Brad, frustrated with keeping their relationship a secret, had likely threatened to reveal the truth to Sher, giving David the motive to kill his friend and maintain his double life. After several days in custody, David appeared in court for a marathon preliminary hearing held in mid-May 2017. There he faced charges for the murder of Brad. He kept his gaze fixed on the floor as the investigating officers testified, and the prosecutors focused on the inconsistencies in the story he had told them. The police described how David had appeared visibly distraught at the scene of Brad's murder, experiencing physical discomfort, including trouble breathing and episodes of vomiting. He also recounted David's initial written statement in which he claimed to be a simple friend who had gone to deliver a weed trimmer and had inadvertently discovered Brad's lifeless body in the basement. The lead investigator presented David's final statement in which he confessed to shooting Brad in self-defense with a weapon that, despite exhaustive efforts, was never found. The autopsy results were a critical turning point that completely dismantled David's self-defense claim, as they showed that the victim, Brad, had been shot twice in the back of the head, which was inconsistent with an act of self-defense. David's defense attorney addressed the court, arguing that David did not pose a threat to society and that the tragic events leading to Brad's death were the result of unique circumstances. He asserted that if a crime had been committed, it was manslaughter, not murder, and claimed that David had acted in self-defense. Meanwhile, David remained silent during the nearly 3-hour hearing where witnesses took the stand. After reviewing all the evidence and testimonies, the judge found probable cause to send the case to the county court and set bail at $1 million. David's defense immediately requested a reduction in the bail amount, arguing that it was impossible for David to pay. However, the judge denied the request. Several weeks later, David's defense attorney filed more than a dozen motions. During a hearing, among these motions was another request to reduce David's bail. Numerous friends and family members of David attended the hearing to show their support. The lawyer asked that the bail be reduced to $250,000, an amount that the Kenny family could manage. He called several witnesses to the stand, including David's wife, his mother, his father-in-law, and his stepfather. All of them testified to David's good character, describing him as an honorable, hard-working, and responsible man, as well as a loving husband and father. Sherry testified that her husband had provided emotional and material support to their 3 children for the past 10 years, even though he was not their biological father. During cross-examination, Sherry was questioned about the events of May 7th when David took her and their daughter to Brad's house. She said her husband told her they were going to return a weed trimmer. When asked by the judge if her husband had acted strangely that day, Sherry said she did not notice anything unusual. At the house, she described how they arrived, knocked on the door, found the back door open, and entered the house, which appeared to have been ransacked before David went to the basement and shouted for her to call 911. After hearing all the arguments, the judge concluded that the testimonies regarding David's character did not justify a reduction in bail. He based his decision on the fact that the defendant had taken his wife and daughter to a house where a dead body was present under the pretense that he was just passing by and was unaware of what had happened. The judge added that David had blatantly lied to his wife and daughter. Later, David's trial began and lasted for a week. During the trial, the prosecution presented the evidence we've already discussed, such as the neighbor's surveillance video showing David arriving at Brad's house before the time of the crime and returning later with his family. The prosecution also showed police body cam footage that clearly demonstrated David had been lying from the start. One of the most striking pieces of testimony came from a forensic expert who discussed the DNA evidence found at the scene. The expert revealed that DNA from a used condom showed Brad's DNA on the outside and the DNA of an unknown male on the inside, but there was no trace of David's DNA. This revelation was controversial because it contradicted the accusations made by a detective who believed that David had decided Brad had to die to keep his secret and his family life intact. According to the detective, David had lured Brad with the promise of sex, killed him, and then covered up the crime as best he could. Meanwhile, the defense maintained that David had acted out of fear and in self-defense. Although the defense attorney admitted that David had not always told the truth and that some of his actions were odd, he reiterated that this did not make David a criminal. The prosecution then countered that 2 bullets to the back of the head were not acts of self-defense, pointing out that Brad had been on his knees when he received the first shot to the upper part of his head and the second to the lower part of his skull. After hearing the closing arguments, the jury deliberated for 4 hours. Tension filled the courtroom as the jury returned, and when the judge read the unanimous verdict, they found David Kenny guilty of the aggravated murder of Brad. The verdict was met with gasps and tears from those present before his sentence was handed down. David was given the opportunity to speak. He began by apologizing to Brad's family for all the pain and suffering he had caused. He said he never intended for any of this to happen and wished he could take it all back. David acknowledged that no amount of apologies could ever bring Brad back, but he wanted the family to know that he truly regretted everything that had occurred. However, the judge was unmoved by David's apologies. The judge recounted the numerous lies David had told to cover up his actions and stated that the crime was a cold and calculated execution followed by an elaborate cover-up. The judge said that David had premeditated Brad's murder, luring him with the promise of sex, setting up the crime scene, and taking multiple steps to conceal his crime. The judge had 4 sentencing options, all involving life imprisonment, but varying in the possibility of parole after 20, 25, or 30 years. David's defense attorney urged the judge to choose one of these options, arguing that David had been a law-abiding citizen with no criminal record before the tragic events of that day. However, the prosecutor urged the judge to impose life without parole, emphasizing that Brad had lost his life and that his family would have to live with that loss forever. In response, the judge stated that if David was capable of ending the life of someone who loved him and was his best friend, it raised concerns about what he might do to someone who opposed him. Therefore, he could not allow David to ever return to public life. In February 2018, David was sentenced to life without the possibility of parole, with an additional 3 years for a firearm specification, meaning he had possessed a weapon while committing the crime. The police remarked that the entire case was a tragedy that could have been avoided if David had not been so concerned with keeping his homosexuality a secret. As of mid-2023, prison records indicated that David remained incarcerated in Ohio. From the moment of his conviction, his attorney had tried to appeal the sentence, always seeking the possibility of parole for his client. But those appeals had been denied tragically. While David would never return to the coal mines, Brad would not either, as both their lives had been irreversibly altered by David. Music actions. Thanks for tuning in to Unreal True Crime. If you're intrigued by mysteries from around the world, check out our new channel, Latin Crimes, where we dive into the gripping true crime stories of Latin America. Don't miss out. Subscribe now for more thrilling investigation.